There we go. All right, sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. Special Darien Board of Education Finance Committee meeting. It's Thursday, March 20th, and it's just about 8 o'clock. Next meeting is April 10th. So first, we're going to start with the normal review of the February 2025 financial report. Oh, Dr. Adley's not here today. He's at a conference, so we have Rich sitting in the main seat.
Right.
Yep.
So this is the financial report through February. We are showing a projected surplus now of $462,859. This is an improvement of $510,557 from January. So the largest change is the state did pass an additional $40 million appropriation for excess costs. So based on the December 1st submissions, that would amount to an additional $503,762 from the previous forecast. So that is the bulk of the change. We did include in the packet a breakdown of all the communities' adjusted reimbursement rates. And so depending on where the town wealth lies, it can be anywhere between 78.8 and 72.8. So for Darien, it's 72.8%. Again, this is based on the December 1st submissions. We did make another submission March 1st. So as the state calculates all the school districts, March 1st submissions, this could change slightly based on that submission.
Is there a bias to which way it typically shifts, or?
Typically districts have more expenses, so I would imagine it might tick down a little bit.
Okay.
So we did receive the first reimbursement of the 60% claim, which is about $1.7 million in February. And so typically the state reimburses the balance in May. And so I would imagine we would get the balance of the new adjusted rate towards the end of May.
And well, we're just there. When we receive the money, like, how is it received? Does it go directly to the town? Does it come to an account?
So it goes, so we have a shared bank account with the town. So it gets deposited into the town as an ACH. And then we record it in our books in the excess cost line item. And then the town has, we do a Board of Ed town reconciliation. And so the town books.
So it automatically goes right to
Yep.
the Board of Ed. Okay, got it. Okay, thanks.
So we do have a positive balance of $124,161 in out of district tuition. We did have a student return to district. We got a small reimbursement from Kerma for workers' compensation for just over $4,000. High school intramural, similar to the previous years, is not running, and so that's a balance of $4,000. We have a small savings in building substitutes for $3,050, and that just has to do with some unpaid days. We had a vacant custodial position at Darien High School, which ended up getting filled a little bit later than we anticipated. So that's an additional savings of a little over $1,100. Gate receipts ended up being slightly short than estimated by $617. ELP tuition, we had a few more identified students, and so we won't collect tuition on that, and that is a deficit of $30,975. And then we have a deficit of $98,000 in special education provider services, mostly for behavioral services, and that'll be another transfer that we'll discuss. Overall general education RCs are a positive $26,939. The special education RCs a positive $435,919 for that total of $462,000. Again, the bulk of that $462,000 has to do with the additional excess cost revenue the state appropriated. Just going through the RCs real quick. As I mentioned, Darien High School, the custodian account shows a positive balance of $3,500. That is salary savings from a vacant position, but it has been filled now. Moving to RC 11, Darien High School open gym is not running, and so that's a savings of $4,000. Gate receipts fell short by about $600. Basketball fell short by short of expectations. And then moving towards RC 24, tuition is showing an overall surplus of $348,439. We had 2 students return to district, and another student will need a new outplacement, which is what we talked about last meeting. Consultant services shows a projected deficit of $98,000. This is for services needed for those returning students, as well as a district BCBA who's out on medical leave. So as I mentioned earlier, the state did issue its estimated revenues. So originally we were at 59.96% for excess costs. The governor did sign an appropriation bill for an additional $40 million. So that $40 million, as I mentioned, provides an additional $503,762 with a reimbursement rate of 72.8%. Then in RC 25 workers' comp, we did receive a credit of $4,018, and then ELP tuition, again, a deficit of $30,975, as we have 4 students who have been classified IEPs.
Okay, before we move on to any of the grants, any questions? Go.
Rich, just one question on the detail of the excess cost by town. I was looking at it and I just was wondering, they rank like the towns like by wealth and you can see whatever. The fifth and sixth ranked aren't listed. Is there a reason for that? I was just curious. I mean, a lot of the Durgate towns are within the 1 to 10 kind of, but is that just people that don't submit any?
So there are
claims?
districts that don't submit anything. Some of the
Yeah.
very smaller towns don't submit
Yeah.
anything. Some choose not to submit because they're so small that the time consuming of submitting isn't
Right.
worth it, or they actually might not have anybody who meets that threshold. Typically, when you're a smaller district, your per pupil is actually higher because you have some of those costs that don't spread out over a number of students. And so when you see some small districts, they actually might have a per pupil of $30,000 per student. And so then that 4.5 multiple.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So the out of district tuition. So the student came back and then there's a couple students that come back earlier. Does that get readjusted for next year as well?
So when we open up the budget for fiscal 26, we'll have to do a transfer in the early stages of the budget, and you'll see a reduction in out of district tuition and an increase in probably consulting.
Okay, so but it doesn't affect what the Board of Finance has now.
No, there won't be any savings, but it will be a line item. adjustment.
Okay, thank you.
Back to ECR. So can we harken back to last year, late in the budget cycle, we made an adjustment downward on ECR. Just remind us what we went to the 70%
Yep.
from.
So originally we had budgeted 75%. The expectation from the state was that they were gonna start spreading out excess costs based on town wealth. With the wealthier towns getting 75%, so that's what we had budgeted. Then when the claims came in for that year, it was lower than anticipated, so we recommended bringing it down to the 70%, in large part because the state didn't put any additional money in their budget for excess costs. So when the claims played out, instead of being 70%, it ended up being really about 60%.
Yeah.
So then we had this shortfall. Claims spiked across the state of Connecticut. So there was a lot of outcry in terms of a lot of districts being short in terms of their excess cost revenue. The government did end up putting $40 million back in. And so $40 million based on the December 1st pool gets us to about that 73%. Again, that could fluctuate up or down depending on how March 1st claims come. You know, the difficulty with excess cost is you're relying on what potentially all 169 communities are filing, if all are filing. And so depending on, you know, our reimbursement rate is impacted by what Danbury's, you know, puts in, or Bridgeport puts in, or New Canaan puts in. And so all those factors play into what we'll get.
It's literally a three-dimensional model. Okay, so, and again, my recollection is right, late in the budget cycle for the fiscal year 25 budget, this current year budget, we made a downward adjustment on the
To 70,
assumptions.
yes.
To 70. Okay, perfect. Any other, go.
Well, on follow up on that, is that something that happened when you got the May reimbursement? Was that when you found out that then we would get lower than what we had expected?
Correct. So when we got the first reimbursement at the end of February, it looked like it was trailing down, and then it was confirmed, right? Usually we find out early May, but don't get the money until.
But this time, because of the additional money they put in, is your expectation that it would come in at around what
Yeah,
you're
so the
expecting?
additional money put in, so if no claims change, it would be that 72.8. If claims go up a little higher, you know, you might be in that 71 to 73% range. So this 40 million is a one-time allocation. The governor's budget that hasn't passed yet has another 40 million, but not for next year, but for the following year for fiscal.
So there's actually a gap now for
Right.
fiscal year
Correct.
26, although,
Correct.
as I've been told, they maintain the vessel, if you will, or the mechanism in which it can be funded, but it just hasn't been funded.
yet.
Yeah, so there's like, it's
Okay.
unknown.
Okay, then another maybe related question. With the federal government moves regarding the Department of Education, does that impact anything with ECR reimbursements
So not for ECR.
or grants?
For federal grants, we do get a little over $1 million between primarily IDEA, which is a special education grant. And then we have a small amount for Title II, about $30,000. So it is about $1 million. So depending on what happens, it could go away. It could turn into a block grant, which means the money just goes to the state and then the state divvies it out. That could change the allocation, but not necessarily make it go away. So that's unknown. We do have about 12 staff members, I believe, in the IDEA grant. primarily paraprofessionals, a couple special education teachers.
But there's been no indication that
That it's
that's
going away.
going away. Okay, so that's just a general concern based on some of the cost cutting efforts at the federal level. Okay,
Thank you.
anything else on this or, okay, maybe just quick grant update.
So no changes in the grant. I will mention it'll likely be on the March report. Greg Darren, who is a teacher leader for Tech Ed, did apply for a Perkins grant, and we have been awarded $34,000 for a Perkins grant. And so we'll see that on the next report.
What is a Perkins grant?
So Perkins grant is school to career, and so Greg applied for funding to enhance like video broadcasting, woodworking shops,
Oh,
things
neat.
like that. And so it's primarily to fund some materials related to that.
Very cool. Look forward to hearing about that. Okay,
Sorry, what does the timing of that look like?
So
Like, when is-
the money is actually available starting in April.
Okay,
And so we do have to spend it down between April and June 30th. So we can't carry it forward, but the items that Greg is looking to fund are like equipment and things like that. So they're one-time purchases that we need.
great. Thank you.
is that a restriction of grant or just our
It's a
budget?
restriction grant.
Okay, got it. Interesting. You don't need a special meeting or anything to get that moving beforehand, no, okay. Okay, anything on food service or,
So the food service account is essentially flat. As I mentioned previously, we are operating the food service budget to effectively be a net zero. So it's right now at 2148 deficit, effectively flat. March, so you'll see in the next month, March is typically our most profitable month. In large part because there are no breaks in March. There's no spring break or February break, things like that. So there are more serving days. And then as that profit grows, that'll fund the lunch monitors and the operating budget and that food service subsidy.
okay, any questions on food service, guys? So budget transfers.
So we do have two transfers recommended for the board. The first is for $98,000 to RC24 consultant services with the balance taken from tuition. And again, these are for student services for students returning to district. And then the second is for $30,975 to ELP tuition with the funds taken from tuition. We do have a couple students classified with an IEP.
Okay, very straightforward and I would recommend them to the board. Agree?
Agree.
Got it. Okay. Okay, consideration of year ending and accelerated expenditures. So just, this is like an initial discussion related to, and we asked staff to create a memo. If we were to, end the year with a, meaningful surplus, as we just discussed, are there items in which we should consider for purchase that fit within the constraints of, this fiscal year 25 budget? So I'll let Rich describe the memo and then we'll discuss next steps.
So as we just mentioned, we are forecasting a positive balance of just over $460,000. So in the past, the district has occasionally taken some surplus dollars and voted to expense things prior to June 30th. It does have to be an item that would be expensed prior to June 30th. So typically it would have to be like a piece of equipment, maybe a repair or a textbook, something along those natures. It can't be something that would carry forward to the following year. We did provide a history of some of those expenses in fiscal year 20. The board did vote primarily for technology items to be pre-purchased. And so we did put forward a couple of buckets in which the board could consider if they wanted to. There were some items that were deferred or reduced from the fiscal year 26 budget, including the ViewSonics at the high school, which are 15 years old and originally were slated on a 4-year replacement cycle. And so year one, the current year we're in, year two was intended to be next year. That's been pushed back. Middle school lab desktops for $23,000, that was reduced as well. We did move that athletic uniform cycle to a 4-year cycle. You could consider moving that to a 3. And speaking with Dr. Adley, it likely would be better to focus on technology items as opposed to maybe athletic uniforms, just because when you do these manipulations, it does create volatility in future years. And so if you were to, let's say, buy uniforms, you might see a spike in the athletic budget in the following year. That's kind of artificial. While you'll see a spike in technology, if you do pre-purchase, we do typically look at the equipment and the hardware items on an individual basis. The board could also consider looking ahead even further at the fiscal 27 budget. So not the budget that the board just approved, but the following year's budget. The ViewSonics are slated for funding in fiscal year 27. As again, I mentioned, it was supposed to be a 4-year replacement cycle. There are office desktops at the middle school that were slated for replacement. Wireless access points throughout the district, that is in the replacement cycle. Administrative laptops are also in the replacement cycle. The last item in that bucket is something we just learned of. The ABS, which is the company we use that monitors our HVAC system at all of our schools with the exception of Middlesex, is ending the life of the software used for the building management system. So it's kind of similar to like when Google end of life's a Chromebook. It's their way of pushing out a new software. And so HHR is slated to upgrade to this new item. So it really affects Oxbridge, which is unfortunate, even though the building's relatively new, Tokenique High School, to get a building management upgrade. I wouldn't necessarily say it's like an emergency. So while the benefit of having that DMS system is you can remote in and address an HVAC issue. The issue here is we would have to actually call the company in, pay time and materials for them to do it. And so the lead time to adjusting something, if something were to fail, is a lot longer. And so it is something at some point that will have to be paid for and upgraded. If the board were to get a reduction to their budget, you could pre-purchase the elementary teacher laptops and the grade 5 Chromebooks. That would be something similar to what happened in fiscal year 20. So as I mentioned earlier, we don't actually get the excess cost money until May. So if the board were to choose any of these options, it would be beneficial to wait until May until we actually have the money in hand. So we're not spending something that we don't get, and there's nothing that happens at the state level where maybe they change their mind. So the recommendation would be to wait until the May Finance Committee to decide if the board wants to do any, all, or none of these items, and then vote at the May, I think it's the May 27th meeting. So it gives a little bit of time for the board to consider the items and then also ensure that we actually have the money in hand.
And I would just add, and we will have the benefit of being beyond the April 8th or 10th date in which the Board of Finance will set its appropriation for the fiscal year 26 budget. So Jill, Robin, we asked them to create this memo as like a reference document, 1, 2, for total transparency in what we may consider as a board later in this fiscal year. So, anybody with interest over our budget has a view of some of the options available, but it's really not, I don't believe it's the time to start discussing what we would do or what wouldn't do or prefer, because there's so many unknowns, starting with the April 8th, 10th date. And then as Rich pointed out, that number can change. So I think what we'll do, as they've outlined, is kind of table this, if you will, till May 15th. We'll have a lot more information as a committee and then as clearly as a board, and we'll follow that timeline in terms of what we'd like to do. I mean, I will say again, as I pointed out, these dollars were actually in previous years, we've gone for supplemental appropriations from the town, or we're working off just a town appropriation. But these are dollars that we had adjusted downward for in the this current year budget that are coming in now from the state. So we got some relief, if you will, from the state. So I personally think it's totally appropriate to talk about some of these items at the right time. We're not just, these are all need to have items too. These aren't nice to haves either. So, but that's the way I envision this going, and opening up for any further discussion on this front.
I don't feel like we need to discuss the merits of the items in here.
Yeah.
But, there is another option, right? Rather than pre-purchasing now the Board of Education can do the non-lapsing account like in the other memo.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay, so I don't feel like the two things are mutually exclusive.
Well, we'll talk about some of the restrictions on the non-lapsing account too. Yeah, I guess that's, maybe we should have talked about the non-lapsing account first, but again, I mean, they kind of go hand in hand in how we would use it. So, can we move on to that? Yeah. So why don't we move on to that then? And then we'll just kind of merge in the discussion.
Great, thank you.
So under prior law, a town board of finance, board of selectmen, or another appropriating body, so like the RTM as an example, was authorized to create an unexpended education account, a non-lapsing account. The requirements were that the amount cannot exceed 2% of a budget. So for us at million and change, you're looking at about 2.4 million roughly. And that the expenditures were authorized by the Board of Education. So under Public Act 2425 or 2445, it now authorizes the Board of Education to create a non-lapsing account. And so you don't necessarily have to have fiscal authority to approve it. So if the board were to create a non-lapsing account, there really are two steps. One, you would have to vote to create a non-lapsing account. And then the second step is you have to vote to put money into the non-lapsing account. And as long as that money does not exceed the 2%, then you're within the standards. So typically districts who do have a non-lapsing account are using it for items that are considered non-reoccurring expenditures because the money is non-reoccurring by definition. It's a surplus fund. And so non-reoccurring expenditures could be things that we discussed previously, like technology equipment. It could be a facility repair, furniture, professional development, things like that. It allows you to carry that money forward and then draw down as long as that balance does not ever exceed 2% of the board's operating budget. Again, for something like this, we would recommend that the board consider it at the May committee meeting, and then again at the May Board of Education meeting. Some districts choose to use it, some districts choose not to use it. In our DIRG currently, Westport and Weston have a non-lapsing account. New Canaan, Wilton, and Ridgefield do not. That may change with the current law in place. It's really how the account works.
So one question, can we create an account and not fund it?
So you can, and so some districts, for example, might have $500,000 left over and they choose actually to only put a portion of that money in the non-lapsing account and then choose to give the other portion back to the town. It's almost like a split. So I know in Weston, as an example, they will put typically about half of the money in the account and give back the other half. And they primarily use it for like minor capital items, so minor facility items. It could be
Things that are unexpected?
unexpected. So it could be an emergency repair, if maybe you had like a plumbing issue or things like that. They typically use it for facility related items. Westport has had a non-lapsing account the longest within the DIRG. They primarily use it for facility items or special education shortfalls. Though they have an MOU with their Board of Finance in terms of they will actually go to their Board of Finance. Once their Board of Ed approves the item to come out of the non-lapsing account, they will actually go to the Board of Finance, almost like you would with a supplemental to let them know we're taking it out for X, Y, and Z purposes. That can also change now with the given law. They don't necessarily have to do that.
Yeah, so that's interesting. These were all created with their Board of Finance support or their fiscal authority support because they were created before this law was, okay. So again, I think, there's a lot of unknowns. I think it's definitely a worthwhile discussion. My bias is if we have the funds and we have directed needs to spend those funds, right? If we have a surplus, but if there's a need to carry over first, can't get it bought in time for the end of the fiscal year, that would be a good reason to create an account. But in my mind, I think we should again progress to May, see what happens in the final appropriation for fiscal year 26, and then adjust accordingly to what we're seeing, what our final number is, and what our needs are, and what our priorities are at the time.
John, clarification question.
Go ahead.
So I'm just trying to, it seems like the two options are what you just described in terms of like, we could take all or a portion of the savings from what we just got. We could spend it on, is there a limit on what you can spend it on? You just have to spend it on something today that's, does it have to be like a capital expense type thing, or could it be like that? That's one question. And then it seems like the other option is you put it into this other fund structure where then you can hold it. And then are there limitations on the types of stuff that you can spend that money on?
So if you were to pre-purchase items without the non-lapsing account, it does have to be an item that you can expense by June 30th. And so it has to be like a piece of equipment, maybe a book, something that you're going to have received and that you can pay out. So you couldn't necessarily use it for a staff member's salary. You couldn't use it for a study, for example, because that study wouldn't be completed. If you were to do a non-lapsing account, that money can carry forward. And so you could do maybe like a building conditions study. So in the board's budget for next year is the study for the middle school. You could create a non-lapsing account and then put money in there and use that because that can carry forward throughout the year. Whereas spending it down before June 30th, you couldn't do that study because that study clearly wouldn't be done by June 30th.
So you understand the distinction, Greg. One,
Yeah.
The first option is basically spending the dollars within the current fiscal year budget. The second option is allowing some flexibility and a non-lapsing account, meaning it carries over the next fiscal year. But there are still restrictions. You don't fund like staff salaries or.
So you
Yeah.
shouldn't, because eventually that money will run out because it's a one-time source of revenue, and then the staff salaries will continue and you won't be able to fund it going forward.
Understood. Okay. But and you could also theoretically do a mix if you wanted,
Yeah.
like some in column A, some in column B,
Right.
and that non-lapsing account, it sounds like if it's 2%, I mean, that's over $2 million of availability.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, it's unlikely that you would have a
Yeah.
surplus of $2 million unless something catastrophic happened.
Like COVID.
Like COVID.
Well, we still got an appropriation that year though, too.
So it's likely that you're talking about, money maybe in the 5 or 6 digits as opposed to the 7.
Yeah. All right. Very helpful. Thank you.
But it's a neat tool if there seems to be a specific need for that. Like I said, I think it's too early to discuss any of this in terms of preferences. But again, for complete transparency and as, appropriations are being considered by the fiscal authority, we thought it was important to kind of show the options that are in front of us and some of administration's different scenarios in which they, if given the approval, would how they would spend these surplus funds right now.
So you said that your preference would be, if nothing changed at all, right now, your preference would probably be for pre-buying.
Yeah, accelerating purchases, I think, on items that are definable and to extinguish the surplus. However, the idea,
Right.
if there weren't enough, the idea of using it for like that Middlesex study would be interesting to me, but I don't think there's enough dollars to kind of carry over.
Right.
I think what
See-
we've tried to do as we've budgeted and as we've eliminated budget control, and I look at what the town's been doing on some of their reserve funds, we've been trying as a whole unit throughout town is collapsing these layers of contingency funds, if you will, because they start overlapping, they create waste for taxpayers. So my bias, my personal bias is use a non-lapsing account when there's a specific need to carry over. But in this case, we have defined needs of, need to haves. And my bias, if nothing changed, would be to, and I'm not going to pick
Right.
which ones, but pick items that
Okay.
made sense. But I also we have to see what our appropriation is.
Right,
Because if it gets
right.
reduced, that whole list and priorities might change a little,
Yeah.
So that's why it's really important we kind of let things play out and then have the discussion of what's most important.
Right. I think that as we have cut away any sort of cushion from our budget the past couple of years, I think that we were able to do that because we really understood what was going on in the economy and the country. I feel like right now, stability is not the number one thing that we can count on. We don't even know if we would get 40 million or however many much in the ECR again next year. So we could
Yeah.
end up again with more special ed costs in a deficit next year, never mind what happens federally. So for me, since we can use it for budget deficits, I would want to have that rainy day fund, as it were, in case we needed to, so we didn't have to constantly go back to the Board of Finance, and ask them to give us more and more appropriations, because I feel like the more we ask them, the more it kind of comes across that we're not necessarily budgeting appropriately. When we are, it's just the circumstances are so unpredictable.
Let me push back on that, because when we ask for appropriations, they've been well defined and there's been great collaboration, especially in last year's chaos, if you will. When I say chaos, there were multiple appropriations last year. And so, they've all proven, especially the bus one, has been proven to be a smashing success. So I just want to push back a little on the fact that if we ask for a special appropriation, there's darn good reason for it.
Yeah,
And we have been instructed by both the Board of Finance and the RTM to not hesitate to raise our hands when we need a special appropriation. And our hit rate on our special appropriations, at least since I've been on the board, is 1,000. So I don't want to create, if you will, a lapsing account because we may be concerned that raising our hand for an appropriation might be pushed back upon. I don't think that's a good practice. Now, we can
Right.
have that philosophical discussion.
Okay.
But
At the end
back
of the
to
year
this.
last year, we were basically in a freeze, or what was that? What did you call
So we
that?
did
A soft freeze?
So in May, we did a soft freeze. We took some we allowed everybody to encumber what they thought they needed through the end of the school year, and then anything that was deemed not encumbered is what we swept.
Right. We knew we were going to ask for an appropriation, and we knew from the Board of Finance that we were going to be helped. Like, we were never worried that we wouldn't be funded.
Yeah.
But I think all these other measures that we had to take in the meantime, put stress on the staff and educators.
Well, again, I mean, last year it was based on ECR, right? What was the, it was the shortfall? What was the main?
Contracted paraprofessionals and a little bit of tuition.
Okay. So again, we can have a philosophical discussion, definitely not this morning, but we'll see as it all shakes out, what the preferences are and what the priorities are.
Right.
Okay. And, again, if I do think in the case of a non-lapsing account, we do get some feedback from the fiscal guys and the RTM, because they're the net arbiters of what is appropriated to us. So listen, I mean, if we take a reserve, or I think you said rainy day fund, and take it, they know it's there. So they're going to make adjustments to our budgets to know it's there if we choose to do that. Right. So in my opinion, I'm not saying what they would do, but if I sat on those, I would make the proper adjustments. So again, we can sit here all morning and kind of talk about what ifs, but I think it's really going to be helpful as we get past April 8th and into May to have a lot more clarity on what's going on and the final appropriation.
Yeah, just one comment. I think in my mind, and we're not there yet, but for longer term planning purposes, or things where we might want to make an investment for the future. For instance, if we were going to have some kind of a transportation depot, and we might have some capital expenses along with that, or anything that might have to do with longer term investments, for instance, for special education, and we would all be talking about this at the board level, but I would think that a non-lapsing account would be a vehicle for something like those, potentially, which, instead of having to go for a special appropriation. But again, I mean, we don't have anything defined at this point.
Yeah.
If we did, I think this would probably be a no-brainer, because then you could say this is what it will be used for, but that's just
Yeah,
sort of up in the air
again,
right now.
I'm not ruling it out either,
Yeah.
guys. I was asked specifically about this year, and that was
Yeah.
my opinion on this year. There could be awesome reasons to carry a non-lapsing account from year to year based on, and you could use it for like a longer term study.
Or you could also choose not to establish it this year, and then maybe next year decide to establish it. It's not like this is your one shot
Yeah.
and only shot to establish it.
Or we could establish it and
And
not
not
fund
fund
it, right? I mean, so that, if you asked me what my bias was, if there were known dollars that we spend down the surplus, I would vote for creating a non-lapsing account. So with the flexibility, so when the time came to fund it, for a good reason, we didn't have to go through the whole process of creating it, and we'd define it, right? Policy would define it. So it'd be well-defined, ready, set up, and it'll be an empty account until we funded it, right? So kind of, that might be a good first step. So, all right, any other comments? Cool. I think we're at public comment. Any public comments?
Good morning. If anybody in person or online would like to participate in public comment, please approach the podium or use the raised hand icon and wait to be recognized. Once recognized, please state your name and address for the record, and note that you have up to 3 minutes to comment.
Hey, Greg, I'm sorry. I didn't call you out. See if you had any other comments.
No, I'm good.
Okay. Okay. Feel better. No.
We have no raised hands.
Katie, no? Okay. Can I get a motion to adjourn?